Wife finds out. Husband is having an affair with her mother, leading to tragedy. Eleanor and Elliot Greenwood's romance blossomed like a storybook tale. They first crossed paths at Meadowbrook University, where Eleanor majored in fine arts and Elliot pursued a business degree. Eleanor caught Elliot's attention beside the university's serene pond, her artistic aura instantly captivating him. Elliot, with his towering presence and engaging smile, charmed Eleanor with his drive and aspirations. Shortly after their college days, they tied the knot, eager to forge a future together in their beloved hometown. Eleanor began teaching art at the local high school, where her enthusiasm for art and mentorship quickly made her beloved by both students and colleagues. Elliot, utilizing his familial networks, secured a role at a renowned investment firm in town, swiftly ascending the career ladder. As time unfolded, the Greenwoods became central figures in the Meadowbrook society, regularly attending galas and city council gatherings. Their residence in Maple Grove, acquired through Elliot's increasing fortunes, stood as a testament to their achievements. Eleanor's artistic flair was apparent throughout their home, from the hand-painted murals in the den to the thoughtfully placed statues in the garden. To onlookers, Eleanor and Elliot exemplified the ideal dynamic duo. Eleanor's artistic sensibilities perfectly balanced Elliot's commercial savvy, her warmth tempering his occasionally stern manner. Their friends often noted the enduring adoration they shared, reminiscent of their university days. However, beneath the veneer of this idyllic existence, tensions simmered. The couple had faced challenges in conceiving, and the burden of numerous fertility treatments had started to strain their bond. Elliot immersed himself more deeply into his career, often staying late at the office. Eleanor sought refuge in her artwork and the connections with her students. During these trying times, Eleanor's bond with her mother, Diana Spencer, a lively widow living on the town's edge who had once traversed the globe as a photojournalist, brought her great comfort and solace. After her father's death, Eleanor decided to settle permanently in Meadowbrook. Diana, seeking solace, embraced a more subdued lifestyle, immersing herself in her garden and volunteering at the local animal shelter. As Eleanor increasingly sought her mother's company, Elliot found himself gradually drawn into Diana's sphere as well. What started as polite exchanges at family dinners gradually deepened, setting the stage for a betrayal that would ultimately fracture the Greenwood family. The roots of the affair between Elliot and Diana were sown on a crisp fall evening. While Eleanor was busy preparing for an upcoming art exhibition featuring her students' work, Elliot, feeling neglected and isolated in his marriage, made a solo visit to Diana's cottage under the pretense of checking on his mother-in-law. Diana, though surprised, welcomed Elliot warmly, offering him a glass of her homemade wine as they settled into her cozy, cluttered living room, adorned with souvenirs from her journeys. As Elliot confided his marital frustrations, Diana listened with deep empathy, her eyes, so strikingly similar to Eleanor's, radiating understanding and compassion. Perhaps it was the intimate atmosphere, the effect of the wine, or just the inherent need for connection, but boundaries were blurred that evening. A comforting touch held a moment too long. A glance carried more weight than intended. By the time Elliot left Diana's cottage, it was clear something significant had shifted between them. In the weeks that followed, they found increasing reasons to meet. Diana suddenly required help with various home repairs, and Elliot took an unexpected interest in gardening. Their meetings became more frequent, each meticulously timed to dodge suspicion. During one such encounter, as they fixed a leaky faucet together in the confined space of her bathroom, the air became thick with unspoken tension. An accidental brush of hands sent a jolt of electricity through both, and as Diana reached past Elliot for a towel, he was enveloped by her scent, a heady mix of jasmine and vanilla that intoxicated him. Their eyes met in the bathroom mirror, and for a lingering moment, neither could turn away on that warm Sunday afternoon. Diana was instructing Elliot on the delicate art of pruning her rose bushes, positioning herself close behind him to guide his movements. Both were intensely conscious of their closeness. The faint brush of her breath against his neck and her warmth pressing against his back sent tingles down Elliot's spine. As he turned to pose a question, their faces lingered just inches apart. Time seemed to freeze, capturing them in a moment filled with forbidden longing. At a family event, during a brief moment alone, Elliot and Diana slipped away to the secluded garden behind the house, Shielded by a trellis draped in climbing roses, they surrendered to their impulses. Their kisses were fervent, their hands exploring each other with a desperation characteristic of fleeting moments. When they heard Eleanor calling for them, they hastily separated, adjusting their attire and smoothing their hair. The guilt struck immediately, yet it was intertwined with the thrill of their clandestine affair, lending a perilous excitement to their forbidden meetings. Their affair rapidly consumed them, obscuring the potential repercussions of their actions. In Diana's bedroom, a place once a sanctuary of solitude, they crafted a realm of secret passion. The creak of bed springs and subdued murmurs composed a symphony of their concealed romance set against a backdrop of familial treachery. As their physical intimacy intensified, so did their emotional entanglement. What began as mere physical attraction evolved into a complex and hazardous bond. They started envisioning a future together, oblivious to the havoc such dreams could inflict on their family. This blend of intense passion and deep emotional connection was destined to be their downfall. In hushed dialogues, they rationalized their actions. Elliot expressed his feelings of being undervalued and misunderstood by Eleanor, while Diana disclosed the loneliness that had engulfed her since her husband's passing. They convinced themselves that their bond was extraordinary, a relationship that defied the norms of convention. As their secret affair grew, so did their web of lies. Elliot began to claim he had business trips and late meetings. Diana pretended to be sick to skip family events. They used a secret email account and disposable phones to communicate, always careful to hide their tracks. But with each lie, their guilt became heavier. Elliot found it harder and harder to look Eleanor in the eye, and Diana's interactions with her daughter became uncomfortable and forced. The relationship that had once been Eleanor's comfort was now spoiled by betrayal. Neither Elliot nor Diana could have predicted the terrible impact their actions would have on the whole Greenwood family. As they continued their affair, they didn't notice the suspicions that were starting to grow in Eleanor's mind. Her first hint that something was wrong happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She had planned to surprise Elliot with lunch at his office, only to be told by his confused secretary that he had left early for a meeting with a client. Eleanor tried to brush it off as a misunderstanding, but doubt had already started to grow. In the weeks that followed, she noticed subtle changes in Elliot's behavior. He seemed distracted, often lost in thought during their talks. His phone would ring at strange times, and he would leave the room to talk in quiet tones. When asked, Elliot brushed off her worries with unclear explanations about work stress and big deals coming up. Eleanor's keen artistic sense, usually a source of happiness, now felt like a burden as she noticed small details that others might overlook. She smelled unfamiliar perfume on Elliot's clothes, saw a lipstick mark on a coffee mug he brought from the office, and noticed how he sometimes avoided her touch. All these clues piled up in her mind, creating a picture she didn't want to admit was real. Her relationship with her mother also started to change. Diana, once always happy to spend time with her daughter, now seemed distant and busy. Their weekly tea times happened less often, with Diana canceling last minute, always saying she had other things to do. When they did meet, Eleanor felt a nervousness in her mother's manner, a hesitation to make eye contact that was completely unlike her. As her doubts deepened, Eleanor felt caught in a spiral of suspicion and self-blame. She questioned every interaction and analyzed every word spoken by Elliot and Diana. Was she just seeing things? Could the stress from their fertility issues and her upcoming art exhibition be making her paranoid? Determined to uncover the truth, Eleanor started to investigate quietly. She checked Elliot's credit card statements and noticed several charges at restaurants and hotels he had never mentioned. She drove past her mother's cottage at unusual times, her heart sinking when she saw Elliot's car parked down the street one evening when he was supposed to be working late. Each new clue felt like a blow, eroding the trust that had once been the foundation of her life. Eleanor's students and colleagues noticed a change in her, the dark circles under her eyes, the shake in her hands as she demonstrated painting techniques, and her smile that never quite reached her eyes. As days turned into weeks, Eleanor became a shadow of herself, torn between facing her fears and holding on to the last bits of hope that she might be wrong. She didn't know that the truth, when it finally emerged, would be even more crushing than she feared. The day everything fell apart for Eleanor began like any other. It was a Saturday, and she had spent the morning at school, adding final touches to the student art exhibition. Elliot had left early, muttering about a golf game with clients. As Eleanor drove home, preoccupied with last-minute details for the show, she impulsively decided to visit her mother's cottage, hoping a cup of tea and a chat might soothe her nerves. As she turned onto the quiet lane leading to Diana's home, her heart nearly stopped. There, behind the cottage, was Elliot's sleek black sedan. For a moment, Eleanor sat frozen in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel. She tried to convince herself there could be an innocent explanation, but deep down she knew. With shaky legs, Eleanor approached the cottage. The curtains were drawn, yet through a small gap, she could see movement inside. Taking a deep breath, she used her key to quietly unlock the door and pushed it open. The scene she witnessed would haunt her forever. There on the floral couch, they were entwined in a close embrace. Unaware of anything else, Diana's hair was tousled and Elliot's shirt was half unbuttoned. On the coffee table, 2 wine glasses sat half empty, silent testaments to their betrayal. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. Then, sensing her presence, Elliot and Diana looked up. Their faces showed shock, guilt, and a trace of defiance. What followed was a whirlwind of emotions and accusations. Eleanor's pained scream broke the silence, startling them. Elliot stood up quickly, stuttering excuses and pleas for forgiveness. Diana stayed seated, her face pale, tears streaming down her face. Eleanor, her voice thick with pain and anger, fired questions at them. Their responses were piercing. 6 months. It had begun as a friendship, and then deepened. They hadn't intended for it to happen. They were sorry. Unable to stay any longer, Eleanor fled the cottage. She drove aimlessly for hours, the confrontation replaying in her mind. By the time she returned home, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the lawn of what had once been her refuge. Sitting in the dark living room, surrounded by symbols of a life that seemed perfect, Eleanor felt something inside her snap. The pain, the betrayal, the overwhelming deception. In that moment, a steely resolve took shape within her. Someone would have to answer for this betrayal, and Eleanor knew exactly who that would be. The events leading up to a tragic confrontation unfolded over several tense hours on that warm summer evening. Having spent the day enveloped in grief and rage, Eleanor found herself pacing her home like a trapped animal. The relentless ticking of the clock in the foyer seemed to taunt her, marking the seconds until her life would change forever. As evening crept in, Elliot returned home, his normally assured walk replaced by cautious steps. Eleanor observed from the dining room shadows as he hung his jacket and loosened his tie, his routine now marred by the weight of his betrayal. Elliot called out Eleanor's name, his voice laced with nervousness. When she stepped into the light, he recoiled slightly. The woman before him was a stark contrast to the vibrant, affectionate wife he had once cherished. Eleanor's eyes were red and sunken, her posture stiff with barely suppressed anger. Elliot, his face a mask of guilt and desperation, began a flurry of excuses and apologies. He spoke of feeling overlooked, of work pressures, and their struggles with fertility. He insisted the affair was a mistake, a moment of weakness that had spiraled out of control. With each word, Eleanor's fury grew, a rising tide threatening to engulf her. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Eleanor walked to Elliot's study. He had kept a handgun there, a precaution after a spate of neighborhood break-ins. In a daze, she took the gun, its cold weight settling in her hand. When she re-entered the living room, Elliot's eyes widened in terror. He backed away, raising his hands, his pleas becoming frantic. He promised to end the affair, to seek counseling, to do anything to salvage their marriage. But Eleanor hardly heard him. Her mind replayed images of Elliot and Diana together, their betrayal looping endlessly. What followed was a blur of movement and noise. Elliot moved towards her, perhaps attempting to disarm her. In that instant of chaos and raw emotion, Eleanor's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot echoed deafeningly in the room, followed by a haunting silence, broken only by the sound of shattered glass from a fallen picture frame. Elliot staggered back, disbelief etched on his face as he clutched his chest. Blood oozed between his fingers, turning his pristine white shirt a deep crimson. He collapsed to the floor, struggling for air, his gaze fixed on Eleanor in a silent plea for forgiveness. As the magnitude of her actions dawned on her, Eleanor dropped the gun. It clattered onto the hardwood floor, the sound snapping her out of her daze. She rushed to Elliot's side, her anger dissolving into horror and regret. Pressing her hands against the wound, she tried desperately to stop the bleeding. Elliot's breaths were shallow, his complexion turning ashen. With shaking hands, Eleanor grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Her voice trembled as she gave their address, urging the dispatcher to send an ambulance quickly. She cradled Elliot's head in her lap, whispering apologies and begging him to hang on. The next few minutes stretched endlessly. Neighbors, drawn by the sound of the gunshot, began to assemble outside. Through the window, Eleanor saw faces filled with concern morph into shock as they glimpsed the scene inside. Voices sounded muffled outside. Someone yelled about calling the police. When paramedics arrived, they swiftly began first aid, working to stabilize Elliot. Eleanor watched in a numb haze as they placed him on a stretcher and hurried him into the ambulance. The sirens dwindled into the distance, leaving her alone in the house. Surrounded by the evidence of her drastic actions, the police arrived shortly after. Detective Sarah Jennings took command, her observant eyes scanning the scene. As officers cordoned off the area and collected evidence, Detective Jennings approached Eleanor, who sat frozen on the blood-stained couch. With a mix of gentleness and authority, Detective Jennings read Eleanor her rights and inquired if she comprehended the situation. Eleanor, her voice faint, recounted the day's events, the discovery of the affair, the confrontation, and the tragic discharge of the gun. Throughout her statement, she appeared almost detached, as if narrating an event that had happened to someone else. As Eleanor was led away in handcuffs, her reality had irrevocably shifted. In court, the prosecutor, Vincent Harding, described Eleanor as a woman out for revenge who had planned a violent act. He argued that the shooting was not a spontaneous act, but a planned one to punish both her husband and her mother for their betrayal. Eleanor's defense team, led by a very experienced lawyer, told a different story. They showed Eleanor as a victim of circumstances, a woman driven to the edge by a betrayal she couldn't imagine. Her lawyer highlighted Eleanor's good character, her positive contributions to the community, and the intense emotional stress she was under when the shooting happened. In their final statements, both sides made strong appeals to the jury. Harding talked about the severity of the crime and the need for justice. Eleanor's lawyer asked the jury to consider the unusual situation and Eleanor's good life until that point. As the jury left to make their decision, the courtroom went quiet. Eleanor's future was now in their hands, along with the closure of a tragedy that had deeply affected the town. After 3 days of hard thinking, the jury found Eleanor guilty of a serious but lesser charge than attempted murder, which was what the prosecution wanted. The courtroom was noisy with surprise and whispers when the verdict was read. Eleanor stood calmly next to her lawyer as the judge, considering her clean past and the special circumstances, sentenced her to 5 years in prison, but allowed for parole after 3 years. Eleanor was also required to get psychological counseling and finish an anger management program. People reacted differently to the sentence. Some thought it was too light for the seriousness of the act, while others felt it was a fair balance of justice and kindness. As Eleanor was taken from the courtroom, she seemed to fully feel the weight of her actions and the long path ahead. Elliot, who had healed from his injuries but was forever changed, had moved to another state to start fresh. He and Eleanor divorced while she was in prison, and they only spoke through formal letters and occasional calls. Despite their painful past, they shared a cautious forgiveness, born from mutual understanding and regret. Diana withdrew from public life completely. She lived almost hidden in her cottage, with her only outside contact being visits from a health aide. The impact of her role in the tragedy had greatly affected her health and spirit. As the town slowly recovered and life moved on, the story of Eleanor, Elliot, and Diana stayed as a strong reminder of how quickly and deeply lives can be changed.